Southampton County, Virginia, 1831. A place where your life was measured not in years but in harvests. Where the price of a human being was listed in ledgers alongside the price of cotton and tobacco. Where a child could be torn from its mother's arms and sold down the river before breakfast, and no law, no court, no moral authority would intervene. A place where reading a single word could get you beaten. Where the sky before dawn was the same color as the soil you would spend that day working until your hands bled. This was Virginia in 1831. And for the enslaved people who lived here, the people who outnumbered their white enslavers in Southampton County, who knew every road and every river and every shadow, it was a world that had one central organizing truth. You were property, not a person, not a soul, property. On the night of August 21st, 1831, one man decided that truth was a lie, and he was going to prove it with fire. His name was Nat Turner, and what he set in motion over the next 48 hours would become the deadliest slave revolt in American history, and would shake the foundations of the institution of slavery so violently that the South would spend the next 30 years building walls against the tremors. But Nat Turner was not simply a rebel. He was something the plantation system had accidentally created and could never fully account for. A man with the education to understand his captivity, the faith to believe he could end it, and the genius to plan how. This is his story, and it is one of the most important stories in American history. Before we go any further, I need to tell you why this story is on Hidden Black Files. Because Nat Turner's name appears in American history education, the way uncomfortable truths always appear, briefly, vaguely, and framed in ways designed to minimize rather than illuminate. He is called a murderer, a fanatic, an extremist. His rebellion is described as violent and short-lived, with the implicit suggestion that its failure was the point, that it proved something about the futility of resistance. What rarely gets taught is the full human being. The child who could recall events before his own birth. The young man who taught himself theology while enslaved. The prophet whose visions were not delusions, but a framework for understanding a world that had decided his humanity didn't count. The military strategist who built an army from nothing and came closer to achieving something genuinely unprecedented than the history books are comfortable acknowledging. I built Hidden Black Files because stories like Nat Turner's deserve to be told in full, not sanitized, not reduced to a paragraph about a violent uprising, but told with the complete weight of what actually happened, what produced it, what it achieved, and what it revealed about the system it challenged. Subscribe to Hidden Black Files right now. Hit the bell. What you're about to hear is the history that was deliberately framed to keep you from fully understanding it. Now Southampton County, 1800. Where it all began. October 2nd, 1800. An enslaved woman named Nancy gives birth on Benjamin Turner's plantation. She names her son Nat. His father's identity is unknown, deliberately left out of records, as the identities of enslaved fathers routinely were, because acknowledging paternity would have complicated the legal fiction that these were not families but livestock. From his earliest days, the people around Nat Turner understood that something was different about this child. He could apparently recall events from before his birth, specific conversations, specific details that no one had told him, in a way that could not be explained, and that both fascinated and unnerved the adults around him. His intelligence was obvious. Startling. The kind of intelligence that the plantation system was specifically designed to suppress, because it was the kind of intelligence that, given any room to develop, would become an existential threat to everything the system rested on. Benjamin Turner made a decision that, by every measure of the logic of his world, should have been obviously dangerous. He allowed Nat to learn to read. Turner's reasoning was the reasoning of a man who believed absolutely in the system he was part of. A literate, educated enslaved preacher would help maintain order among the enslaved population. Religion, properly managed, was a tool of control. A black man who could read scripture and preach it was an asset. What Benjamin Turner failed to account for was this: a man who can read scripture can also read everything else. A man who can interpret God's word for other people has power that does not depend on his owner's permission. A man with a book and a mind capable of using it is no longer entirely yours. Turner had handed Nat Turner a weapon and called it a gift. The education that Benjamin Turner provided, allowing Nat not just to read but to study Christianity, to develop his theological understanding, to write, produced something that the plantation system had no framework for processing. Other enslaved people noticed it immediately. They used a phrase to describe him that has survived in the historical record. He had a quickness of apprehension that set him apart. He could outthink, outspeak, and outmaneuver anyone he encountered. His mind worked at a speed that was observable to the people around him. He was not just intelligent. He was the kind of thinker who changed the quality of thought in every room he entered. And alongside the intellectual development, something else was happening. Nat Turner was having visions. Not metaphorical visions. Not simply a sense of spiritual calling. Visions. Specific, vivid, detailed images of conflict and struggle and divine purpose that he experienced with the conviction of a man receiving direct communication from God. Other enslaved people began calling him the prophet. As Nat was transferred from owner to owner, Benjamin Turner, then Samuel Turner, then Thomas More, then Joseph Travis, his reputation moved with him. His power over the people around him grew. His visions became more frequent, more specific, more urgent. The plantation owners of Southampton County had created, through their own decisions, the precise combination of qualities that their system most feared. A man with the intelligence to plan a rebellion, the charisma to build an army, the spiritual authority to convince people that dying for freedom was not just possible but divinely ordained. All he needed was a sign. 1821, Nat Turner disappeared from the plantation. For 30 days, overseers searched. They assumed what everyone assumed when an enslaved person vanished, that he had run, that he was trying to reach the north, that they would need to send word to other counties, post notices, send dogs. And then Nat came back, not because he had been caught, not because he was hungry or frightened or had run out of options. He came back, he said, because God had ordered him to return, that his purpose would be fulfilled here in Southampton County, not in flight. The owners breathed again. Their educated preacher had learned his place. The crisis had passed. They were profoundly wrong. What Nat's return actually represented was not submission. It was strategy. He understood, with the clarity of a man who had been thinking about this for years, that a successful rebellion required roots, preparation, trust, an army built over time from people who knew each other, who had tested each other, who were ready. You couldn't build that on the run. You built it by staying, by waiting, by watching. By 1825, Nat wasn't simply studying the Bible. He was understanding his divine purpose within it. While other enslaved people worked until their hands bled, Nat would disappear for days at a time, fasting, praying, searching the natural world for the signs he had been promised. His first vision arrived with the force of revelation. He saw two armies, opposing races locked in fierce conflict, something like angels and demons clashing across the Virginia sky. A prophecy of war, of a battle that was coming, and that he would be part of. The vision that made everything real came in 1828. A voice, clear, unmistakable. The same spirit that had spoken to the biblical prophets was now speaking to an enslaved man in Virginia. The time was coming. February 12, 1831. A solar eclipse crossed the sky above Southampton County. Nat Turner looked up and saw what no one else at that moment saw. Not a celestial event, not an astronomical phenomenon, but a message written in the language he had been learning to read for 20 years. A black hand covering the sun. 6 months later, on August 13th, The sun appeared with a bluish-green hue, another aberration in the sky, another sign in the language of the divine. For Nat Turner, the message was no longer open to interpretation. The time for prayer was over. The time for action had come. Here is a question we want you to sit with, and we want your answer in the comments. Nat Turner's entire framework for understanding his rebellion was theological. He believed he was acting on direct instruction from God. How does knowing that context change how you understand his actions? And does the source of someone's conviction change how we should evaluate what they did with it? Leave your answer below. We read every comment. Nat Turner had studied slave revolts the way a general studies the campaigns of generals who came before him. He understood why they failed. Every major rebellion had collapsed because too many people knew too much, too soon. Information leaked. Someone talked. A loyal enslaved person, loyal to the owner, out of fear or calculation or genuine attachment, passed word. Soldiers arrived before the rebellion could become an army. Nat was not going to make that mistake. He chose 4 men: Henry, Hark, Nelson, Sam. Men he had known for years. Men who had been hardened by bondage into something the plantation system had not intended to create. Soldiers. Men who were not simply willing to risk their lives for freedom, but who had already made the internal calculation that a life under these conditions was not worth preserving at the cost of submission. The plan he shared with them was simple in its structure and radical in its logic. No stockpiling weapons. No gathering supplies. No doing anything that could be observed and reported. In Nat's own words, we would slay our enemies with their own weapons. They would move through the night. They would take weapons from the people they encountered. Each successful action would supply the next. The army would grow as they moved, drawing in enslaved people from every plantation they passed through. The armory in Jerusalem, the county seat, was the target. Once they held those weapons, they could arm an army large enough to change everything. The night of August 21st, 1831, 7 men gathered at Travis's cider press, and then they moved into the darkness. The Travis plantation was first. Joseph Travis, the man who legally owned Nat Turner, who had fed him and housed him, and who probably believed, in the way that slave owners believed things that were convenient to believe, that their arrangement was tolerable, if not acceptable, was asleep. His family was asleep. They never woke up. The rebels moved through the house in silence, taking the lives of everyone inside before anyone could raise an alarm. Nat had designed the opening of the rebellion to be exactly this: swift, silent, complete, giving Southampton County no warning of what was coming. Then something happened that Nat had not planned, but that revealed the true nature of what he had started. An enslaved man named Austin, who lived on the same farm, saw what was happening. He had not been part of the original group, had not been recruited, had not sworn any oath. He simply saw the moment and understood what it meant. He joined. 7 became 8. This pattern, enslaved people seeing the rebellion in motion and stepping into it, would repeat throughout the following hours. The army Nat built was not purely the product of his planning. It was also the product of something the plantation system had been desperately suppressing for generations. The desire for freedom that was present in virtually every enslaved person, waiting for the moment when acting on it, seemed more possible than not acting on it. By sunrise, stealth had given way to open movement. At Elizabeth Turner's plantation, Austin raised a gun and fired the rebellion's first daylight shot. The revolt was no longer a secret. It was a war. Nat's military instincts were immediately evident. He split his forces. One group on horseback, one on foot. A tactical decision that made them simultaneously faster and more adaptable, capable of approaching objectives from multiple directions, and of pursuing or retreating independently. At Catherine Whitehead's plantation, something happened that would become one of the most analyzed moments of the entire uprising. 27 enslaved people watched as Nat's army surrounded the house. The rebels expected them all to join, expected that when the moment came, when freedom was actually present, visible, armed and moving, the enslaved people of Southampton County would rise as one. Only one joined. The others stayed. This is a moment that requires careful understanding rather than judgment. These were people who had known nothing but servitude, who had watched what happened to those who challenged the system, who understood that failure meant something far worse than continued bondage. Fear is not cowardice when the consequences of action include torture and death. The enslaved people who did not join Nat Turner were making the most rational calculation available to them with the information they had. But for Nat, that moment crystallized something. He pressed on, and at the Whitehead Plantation, for the first and only time in the rebellion, Nat Turner took a life with his own hands. Margaret Whitehead. Her death marked the point of no return. Not just legally, not just practically, spiritually. The Prophet's Islam had become something else, something the plantation system would not be able to simply absorb or dismiss. He was a general who had crossed his own Rubicon. Levi Waller had heard the rebels were coming. He made the decision that made a terrible kind of sense, in the logic of a man desperately trying to protect his household. He gathered all the children together in one place, believing that concentration would make them easier to defend. When Nat's army arrived, Waller himself escaped into the woods. His wife and 10 children did not. This is the moment in Nat Turner's story that demands the most honest engagement: the deaths of children. It is also the moment most often used to reduce the entire rebellion to an act of brutality, divorced from the context that produced it. Here is that context. The system Nat was attacking was not simply an economic arrangement or a social structure. It was a system that routinely destroyed black children, that sold them, that worked them until they broke, that legally defined them as property from the moment of their birth, that stripped them of their names, their families, their futures. This does not make the deaths at Waller's farm something other than terrible. It makes them part of a complete picture that the history books present incompletely when they describe Nat Turner's violence without the prior violence that produced it. We are not asking you to approve. We are asking you to understand. The army moved. 7 became 20. 20 became 40. By the following morning, more than 70 men had joined the uprising, former property, moving as an armed force through Southampton County, heading toward the armory in Jerusalem that represented the possibility of something even larger. And in the movement, something revealed itself about what this rebellion was fundamentally about. Nat's army spared the poor whites, the people who owned no enslaved persons, the people who had no stake in the plantation system's hierarchy, the people who were themselves, in some ways, victims of the same economic arrangement that enslaved black people, even if their victimization bore no comparison. This was not random violence. This was targeted dismantling. The wealthy white landowners who built their entire lives on the premise that some human beings were born to own and others born to be owned. They were the target, not whiteness, not random vengeance. This system, in less than 24 hours, 55 people were dead, and on the horizon, the militia was forming. The turning point came at James Parker's farm. Nat's main force had gone to the enslaved quarters to recruit more fighters. He left a small lookout group at the gate. Alexander Pete's militia hit the lookout group fast and hard, but Nat's main force heard the engagement and exploded back from the quarters with enough fury to break the militia's formation completely. The militiamen ran. The rebels pursued and ran straight into a trap. Additional militia forces, drawn by the sounds of the first engagement, were waiting. In the chaos of the ambush, Nat's army shattered. Men scattered into the Virginia wilderness. The military cohesion that had made them so effective evaporated under the pressure of an engagement they hadn't planned for and couldn't absorb. Nat gathered survivors through the night at Thomas Ridley's plantation. By nightfall, 40 men had made it back, but something had changed beyond the numbers. The loss at Parker's Farm had done something to the Army's confidence that tactical regrouping couldn't fix. In the dark hours before dawn, their own scouts returning with reports of militia movements triggered panic. Men mistook their own people for the enemy. They fled to Samuel Blunt's plantation, believing it abandoned. Blunt and 5 others were waiting. The Army broke completely, and what came next was not a military campaign. It was a hunt. 3,000 men poured into Southampton County. Soldiers, militia, vigilantes, men who had come not to restore order but to deliver a message written in the most extreme terms available. A witness named Nelson Allen wrote home, "Every man is armed with a gun by his bed nights and in the field at work. A great many of the blacks have been shot, their heads taken off, stuck on poles at the forks of roads. Over 100 black people were killed in the reprisals. Most of them had nothing to do with Nat Turner's rebellion. They were killed because they were black, because they were present, because the terror that the rebellion had unleashed needed somewhere to go, and the system had always directed its terror at the same targets. Suspects were tortured, burned. One man had his foot nearly destroyed before his interrogators realized he had no connection to the uprising whatsoever. The violence became so extreme that even a white newspaper editor had to acknowledge it was hardly inferior in barbarity to the atrocities of the insurgents. On August 28th, General Richard Epps issued a military order. Any person who harmed an enslaved person without cause would face military punishment. The state had to restrain its own citizens from the level of violence they were inflicting. Read that again. The authorities who hunted Nat Turner had to issue orders against the excessive brutality of the people hunting alongside them. We want to ask you something here, and this is one of the most important questions this history raises. The reprisals after Nat Turner's rebellion killed over 100 black people, most of them innocent. The state had to order its own citizens to stop. What does that response, its scale, its indiscriminate nature, its barely controlled fury, tell you about the psychological relationship between the plantation system and the people it enslaved? Leave your answer in the comments. August 31st, 1831. Southampton County Courthouse. The trials began. The judges understood that the world was watching, not just Virginia, not just the South, but the entire country, and, through the abolitionist press, much of the Western world. They constructed what looked like a performance of justice, appointed defense attorneys, required proper charges, dismissed cases that lacked evidence. But the conclusion was never in question. 30 enslaved people faced the most severe possible sentences. For 12, young, reluctant, minimally involved, the governor agreed to clemency. For the other 18, execution. One by one, through the fading of summer into autumn, the condemned were hanged along Southampton County's roads. Their deaths were public and deliberate, meant to send the message that resistance carried consequences that no vision or prophecy or divine conviction could protect you from. But the man who had started it all was still missing. For 6 weeks after the rebellion collapsed, Nat Turner lived in a hole in the earth. Near the birthplace of his revolution, he had dug a hiding place, concealed by pine needles and fence rails. He subsisted on rotted food and rainwater. He was the most wanted man in the American South, with a $500 reward for his capture, alone, underground, listening to the footsteps of the world above him. 6 weeks. On October 30th, a dog found him. The animal had caught the scent of meat from a nearby hiding place and returned with 2 black hunters following its trail. Nat emerged from the earth and begged them to keep his secret. Their retreating footsteps told him everything he needed to know. He fled. But the Virginia wilderness had no more shelter to offer. On November 1st, a farmer named Benjamin Francis found him. Armed, Nat surrendered. The iron bars of Jerusalem jail could hold his body. They could not hold his voice. For 3 days, a local lawyer named Thomas R. Gray sat across from Nat Turner and transcribed everything. His visions, his motivations, his theology, his planning, his assessment of what he had done and what it meant. Gray was in a hurry. He was racing to copyright the document before his subject could meet the hangman. A businessman first, Gray was not primarily interested in justice or history. He was interested in a document that would sell. But the document he produced, the Confessions of Nat Turner, became one of the most important texts in American history. Because even filtered through Gray's perspective, even shaped by the constraints of what Nat could say and what Gray chose to record, the voice that comes through is unmistakably that of a man who knew exactly what he had done, why he had done it, and what it meant. Not a madman, not a brute, a theologian, a strategist, a man who had spent his entire life thinking about the world he lived in and had arrived, through that thinking, at a conclusion that the plantation system could not survive hearing spoken aloud, that it was wrong, that it had always been wrong, that no amount of law or custom or violence could make it otherwise. November 11th, 1831. Nat Turner walked to the gallows with his head held high. Virginia executed him, defiled his body, dissected it, and carved pieces of his skin into trophies. Because even in death, the system needed to assert that it had won. It hadn't. The immediate legislative response to Nat Turner's rebellion revealed something the plantation system had been desperate to conceal. It could only be maintained through absolute control, not through the benevolence of enlightened masters, not through the natural acceptance of enslaved people who had, as the pro-slavery argument claimed, been civilized and cared for, and given their proper place in society. Only through terror, Virginia moved swiftly to ban all education for black people, enslaved and free. Gatherings were restricted. Black church services required white ministerial supervision. Knowledge, the Virginia legislature had concluded from Nat Turner's rebellion, was more dangerous than any weapon. And they were right. They had always been right about that. It was why they had tried, for generations, to prevent black people from reading. Because a people who could read could think, and a people who could think could arrive at the same conclusion Nat Turner had arrived at. But Virginia's response went further than restriction. In Richmond, Thomas Jefferson's own grandson rose before the Virginia legislature and proposed something that would have been unthinkable 12 months earlier: gradual emancipation, the complete end of slavery in Virginia. The vote failed, but the fact that it was proposed at all, that Nat Turner's rebellion had created enough political pressure to put the question of emancipation onto the floor of the Virginia legislature, reveals the actual stakes of what happened in Southampton County. It was not a failed revolt, it was a political earthquake. In the North, a different lesson was being absorbed. William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, the most prominent abolitionist publication in the country, presented Nat Turner's rebellion not as a horror story, but as confirmation. Confirmation of what abolitionists had been arguing for years, that beneath the South's carefully maintained image of contented enslaved people and benevolent masters lay something that the Southampton Rebellion had made impossible to deny. Resistance, not passive, occasional, individual resistance. Deep, structural, organized resistance. A desire for freedom so powerful that when it finally found expression, it moved with military precision through one of Virginia's most prosperous counties and left 55 people dead before it was contained. The South's response to Nat Turner, the new restrictions, the new laws, the intensified surveillance, the terror, told the rest of the country something the pro-slavery argument had never been able to adequately explain. If the system was as natural and benign as its defenders claimed, why did it require this much force to maintain? For the next 30 years, Southampton County haunted American political life like a ghost that no legislation could exorcise. Every debate about slavery happened in the shadow of August 1831. Every Southern politician who argued that enslaved people were content and well cared for argued it knowing that a jury in Southampton County had recently sentenced 18 men to death for choosing freedom over that contentment. Nat Turner had made the lie visible, and visible lies have a finite lifespan. Today, a bronze marker stands in Southampton County, Virginia. The debates about Nat Turner have not ended. They may never end. Murderer or freedom fighter, terrorist or revolutionary, religious fanatic or strategic genius. These labels say more about the people applying them than they do about the man they're applied to. Here is what is not in dispute. In August 1831, an enslaved preacher who had been taught to read by the man who owned him used that education to understand his captivity, his world, and his God, and concluded that what was being done to him and the people around him was so fundamentally wrong that correcting it was worth dying for. He was not wrong about the fundamental injustice. He was not deluded about the divine importance of human freedom. He was not mistaken in believing that the system he was challenging would only change under pressure it could not absorb. He was simply one man, with one army in one county, against a system that stretched from Virginia to Texas and had the full legal and military power of multiple state governments behind it. He lost the battle, but what he set in motion, the crack he put in the South's confidence that slavery could be maintained indefinitely without consequence, contributed to the pressure that eventually made the Civil War inevitable. Nat Turner did not free the enslaved people of Southampton County, but he helped make the freedom of 4 million Americans possible. We want to end with the question that we believe is the most important one this story raises, and we genuinely want your answer in the comments. History labels Nat Turner's rebellion as a failure because it was militarily defeated. But the Virginia legislature subsequently banned black education, proposed gradual emancipation for the first time, and the entire South spent 30 years living in fear of another Southampton. By those measures, was it really a failure? What do you think? Before we close, a moment for why Hidden Black Files exists. I built this channel because I grew up learning Nat Turner's name attached to a sentence about a slave revolt in Virginia. A sentence, for a man whose life and mind and faith and strategy represent one of the most complete arguments against the institution of slavery that any single person ever made. The paragraph version of this story is designed to make you afraid of him. The full story makes you understand him. And understanding him, understanding what produced him, what he concluded, what he did, and what it cost him, is essential to understanding not just slavery but the entire arc of Black American history. These are the stories that make the present legible. These are the names that deserve to be spoken in full. Subscribe to Hidden Black Files. Share this video. Leave a comment with your answer to the questions we've asked today. Because if we don't tell these stories, if we allow the sentence to stand in for the life, then Nat Turner is buried twice. Hidden Black Files exists, so that never happens.